I have a confession to make. I thought I understood money, but I really didn't. I spent much of my adult life studying money, investing, and saving. I read books, I listened to podcasts. I spent 20 years of my career listening to CNBC on my commute. I thought I understood money and how it worked, but I really didn't. It wasn't until I read this book, Broken Money by Lyn Alden, that I really understood how money worked and the current state of our financial system. Lyn Alden is an electrical engineer by training, but she spent most of her career working in finance. As an engineer myself, I really appreciate the approach she takes in explaining these complex topics. This book is long and dense, it's over 500 pages, and Lyn backs up her writing with hundreds of citations to other works and dozens of charts and graphs. The book argues that our current financial system, which is dominated by central banks and fiat currencies, is fundamentally broken due to technological mismatches and power imbalances. Throughout the book, Alden traces money's history through the lens of technological innovation. She begins with ancient currencies like shells and beads, and continues all the way through modern technologies like blockchain and Bitcoin. She emphasizes how technology drives permanent change to how money works. Frankly, much of the book paints a pretty bleak picture to the current state of our financial system. However, the book ends with a message of hope, suggesting that Bitcoin could be part of the solution to help return us to a system built upon sound money. Now, let's walk through the book at a high level. The book has 30 chapters that are broken up into 6 parts. Part 1 is What is Money? Part 2 is The Birth of the Banks. Part 3 is The Rise and Fall of Global Monetary Orders. Part 4 is The Entropy of Fiat Ledgers. Part 5 is Internet Native Money. And Part 6 is Financial Technology and Human Rights. Part 1 is What is Money? It has 4 chapters, and this is where Lyn really works through the historical development of money dating back to thousands of years ago in ancient times. Chapter 1 is Ledgers as the Foundation of Money, and this chapter, right from the start, really opened my eyes to what I had been missing in my understanding of money, and it really becomes the foundation for the rest of the book. In this chapter, Lyn Alden explains that money is fundamentally a ledger, and the ledger is used to record value and obligations. She recounts history dating way back to 3000 BC and how clay tablets were used to record obligations and value in exchange from one person to the next. This was one of the first recorded historical uses of money as a ledger. But she spans through the history from then till now and how different technologies were used to present better ledgers over time based on the latest technology. Chapter 2 is The Evolution of Commodities as Money. In this chapter, she reviews the historical primitive currencies such as shells, salt, and cattle, and explains why commodities like this were chosen by those ancient populations to use as money. She explains 3 main reasons. One is durability, that the commodity could hold up over time. Second is divisibility, that it could be divided into smaller units. And third, and probably most important, is scarcity. You couldn't just easily make more of the commodity. She contrasts this to how our fiat monetary system developed and why our current state, where money could be freely printed, is weakening our monetary system. Chapter 3 is How Gold Won the Commodity War. And in this chapter, Lyn explains how gold became the dominant commodity money and really sustained that over thousands of years, really up until current times. And she introduces a key factor in this, which is called the stock-to-flow ratio. The stock-to-flow ratio is how much new supply is added to a currency versus the current stock. And gold, while it's mined every year, its stock-to-flow ratio is about 62, which made it superior to other commodities and other metals, including silver and others. So this chapter kind of lays a foundation to gold as a relatively hard store of value that's a foundation for our monetary system. Chapter 4 presents a unified theory of money. And in this chapter, Lyn walks through 2 competing historical explanations of money. One was the commodity theory that was presented by Carl Menger, and this was money as commodities or valuable goods, such as gold. And the second was the credit theory of money, which was presented by Alfred Mitchell Innes, and this was money as IOUs. She walks through these two competing theories and proposes a synthesis of those two concepts and presents that money is a ledger that's either backed by natural scarcity or commodities or institutional trusts like trust in our government or trust in banks, but both require technology to verify the soundness of the ledger and prevent inflation. And she presents in this chapter a concept that's throughout the book is entropy, which is a scientific term of increasing disorder over time. And she presents this as a risk to unsound money, that over time you can get more and more debasement or fraud in the monetary system. And she also explains some historical examples, such as Egypt's rapid devaluation of their currency, that present examples of unsound money. Part 2 is the birth of the banks. And in this section, Lyn walks through the development over past centuries and past millennia of banks and the banking system built on top of those primitive currencies. Chapter 5 is proto-banking and the Hawala system. In this chapter, she highlights the informal networks that developed over time, such as the medieval Islamic Hawala, where trusts and offsets enabled borderless transfers without physical money. She praises the low cost and efficiency of this type of network, but highlights the risk. Mainly, it's opaque and requires trust in the individuals that are maintaining the ledger. She forecasts to new technologies such as stablecoins that she covers later in the book, how they also require trust in the provider of the network. Chapter 6 is the innovation of double entry bookkeeping, and she explains and credits Luca Pacioli, who in 1494 developed the concept of double entry bookkeeping. And this system really enabled the scalable banking in Italy. This method, which includes debiting and crediting simultaneously, allowed banks to track complex ledgers and fueled trade in Venice and Florence at the time. And Alden explains how this system reduced errors and fraud, but opened the door to fractional reserve lending, meaning lending out more than what the bank holds in reserves, which this, of course, over the centuries has led to various bank crises. Chapter 7 is free banking versus central banking, and contrasts decentralized free banking, like 19th century Scotland model, where banks could competitively issue notes that were backed by gold, versus the centralized models like the U.S. Federal Reserve, which was formed in 1913. Free banking minimized inflation because it had market discipline, but it led to panics such as that in 1907 that led to the tendency toward centralization, such as the formation of the U.S. Federal Reserve. Alden details the shift from the wildcat banking era to the period of Fed control. The period of Fed control led to the suspension in 1933 of the dollar's redeemability into gold and gave the government monopoly over the money supply. She argues that central banks centralize power, which enables surveillance and debasement of the currency. However, it does also allow the Fed and the government to respond and provide liquidity at times of crises. Chapter 8 is the speed of transactions versus the speed of settlement, and it highlights the impact that speed has had on the soundness of our money over the past centuries. It goes back into the early 1830s, before the telegraph existed, and explained that under the gold system, the gold had to be transported by horse-drawn carriage, which was slow and cumbersome. When the telegraph was introduced, the communication of transactions could happen at light speed. However, settlement lagged behind, and this impacted the soundness of the money. She refers to a book that was from 1875 by William Stanley Jevons that was called The Money and Mechanisms of Exchange, which way back in 1875, Jevons was already acknowledging this disconnect between the speed of transactions and the speed of settlement and the risk that it posed to the money system. Next is Part 3, the rise and fall of global monetary orders. Chapter 9 is printing money for war, and this chapter really hit home to me, and opened my eyes about how the unsoundness of our money has enabled many, many wars in recent decades. She explains how World War I led to the suspension of currency convertibility to gold, and this was done to allow funding the war without the peg of the gold wealth that the nations held. And she also explains how World War II was funded by money printing. She details how Britain in particular printed money and debased their currency in order to fund World War II. Chapter 10 is the Bretton Woods system and explains the 1944 agreement that established the U.S. dollar as the global reserve currency. This post-World War II system pegged other world currencies to the dollar and pegged the dollar itself to gold at a rate of $35 per ounce. This system enabled post-war trade to resume, but it overburdened the U.S. gold reserves. And that burden led Richard Nixon in 1971 to suspend the link to gold, which led to the current monetary system in which the dollar has no link to any hard asset. Chapter 11 is the rise of the petrodollar. The petrodollar has established the U.S. dollar as the primary currency for use in global trade of oil. This has had benefits for the United States because it has brought down the United States government's borrowing costs because the petrodollar drives high demand for U.S. treasuries. On the flip side, this dependence on the U.S. dollar has resulted in financial crises around the world, especially in smaller nations. Chapter 12 is entitled Pushing Chaos to the Periphery. This chapter expands on the concept introduced in Chapter 11 about the negative impact that the U.S. dollar's reserve status has on small and emerging countries around the world. In this chapter, Alden explains that this system essentially results in the U.S. importing goods from these countries while exporting inflation due to the debasement of the U.S. dollar. Alden explains how this has a huge impact, particularly on the small and emerging countries around the world. And this negative impact has put the countries in a position where they need to be dependent on outside bodies, such as the IMF or the International Monetary Fund. The IMF was established to provide aid through loans to these small countries. And unfortunately, this aid has resulted in ongoing dependence on those bodies, such as the IMF. Chapter 13 is Heavy is the Head That Wears the Crown, and in this chapter, Alden explains the burdens of maintaining reserve currency status has on the United States. Alden explains a key term, the Triffin dilemma, where being the reserve currency results in U.S. trade deficits, which in turn undermine the confidence in the dollar. This chapter concludes that holding reserve currency status has short-term benefits for the United States, but presents long-term challenges. Part 4 of the book is the entropy of fiat ledgers. And here, Lyn Alden is using a scientific and engineering term of entropy to define the steady decline of stability of the monetary system. The definition of entropy is the gradual decline into disorder, and this is seen in engineering and natural systems, where systems begin to be balanced and functional, but slowly decline and become more disorderly. In this section, she's applying that concept to explain what's currently happening with our monetary system. Chapter 14 is the modern financial system. In this chapter, Lyn explains how complex this system has become. She explains how it has resulted in layers of ledgers being built on top of each other. It starts with the central bank issuing base money at the first layer, but then commercial banks expand the money supply by issuing loans. And on top of that, there's other derivatives, which has literally resulted in quadrillions of dollars worth of derivatives based on that base money supply. Chapter 15 is how fiat currency is created and destroyed. In this chapter, Lyn explains how fiat currencies like the US dollar can be created, such as through quantitative easing, or how they can be destroyed, such as through taxation or default. A fundamental concept that she introduces in this chapter is the Cantillon effect. And the Cantillon effect really is summed up by the old saying, the rich keep getting richer and the poor keep getting poorer. And the reason is the rich hold assets like stocks or real estate, that the value of those assets goes up if the currency is debased. So the rich benefit, But the poor do not hold those assets. So they are living paycheck to paycheck, and they see the impact of higher grocery prices, higher cost of living, but they don't benefit from the debasement as the wealthy do. That sums up the Cantillon effect that's explained in this chapter. Chapter 16 is Pricing as a Mechanism for Organization. And in this chapter, Lyn explains how fiat currency distorts prices and leads to bubbles. One key example that she shares is the 2008 housing crisis. Alden explains that in an ideal economy and government, the government would vary its government spending based on what the status of the economy is. If the economy needed stimulus, the government would increase spending. But if the economy begins running hot, they would pull back spending and even run a surplus. Chapter 17 is the financialization of everything. In this chapter, Lyn Alden laments the fact that our economy has shifted from a focus of producing goods to a focus more on finance. And as the money degrades, that this leads to instability. It causes the wealthy to store value in other things like real estate, stocks, or even collectibles. And it incentivizes them to short the dollar because it's being debased by taking out dollar debt and putting that value into things like real estate. And this has a disparate impact on the poor in the society. Chapter 18 is Beneficiaries of the Cantillon Effect, where she expands on this concept that was introduced in previous chapters. She shares a startling statistic that the top 1% wealthiest in the population capture 90% of the gains from money printing. She shares a few examples at various levels of the economy how this impact is seen. For example, a low-income person or working class individual sees the negative impact of debasement because their wages don't go far, but they can't access cheap debt or can't save for a down payment on a home, so they don't see the upside. Whereas the wealthy can accumulate multiple homes because they have access to cheap U.S. debt. The second example she shares is at the company level. She shares that a mom and pop small hardware store, for example, can't compete with Lowe's and Home Depot because they don't have the same access to low interest debt. And she shares an example with banks. Even banks are negatively impacted by this, and she shares that in recent decades, small and mid-sized banks have been gobbled up and consolidated with large banks because the efficiencies of the large bank give them more access to the Cantillon effect. Chapter 19 is the long-term debt cycle. In this chapter, Lyn shares some of the writings from Ray Dalio, who has studied history and the fact that over time there has typically been a deleveraging crisis every 50 to 75 years. Lyn shares the fact that our debt is expanding exponentially and starting to reach a breaking point. Wealth and debt have been concentrating over time, and we're currently at very high levels, and this needs to be resolved. She believes that we are currently at the later stages of a debt cycle, and the problems are becoming more and more evident. Part 5 is Internet Native Money. It is in this section where Lyn explores modern technologies like cryptocurrency and Bitcoin and how they might provide a solution to our monetary crisis. Chapter 20 is the creation of stateless money. And by stateless money, Lyn means money that is not dependent on a government. The chapter details how in 2009, Satoshi Nakamoto responded to the 2008 financial crisis by developing and releasing Bitcoin. The chapter details previous attempts at using cryptography to have a trustless form of money that didn't work out. Some of these were developed in the 1980s, 1990s, and early 2000s, and Satoshi learned from each of those to develop Bitcoin. Some examples of those currencies were eCash, eGold, and Hashcash. They all made incremental steps towards successful digital currencies, but all had their shortcomings. Satoshi learned from those shortcomings and built Bitcoin based on it. And Bitcoin is the first successful cryptography-based peer-to-peer money. And today it has grown successfully, and there are currently tens of thousands of users and a network of Bitcoin miners that support the network. Chapter 21 is Bitcoin's path to monetization. This chapter traces the adoption of Bitcoin from being a cypherpunk tool to being a true global store of value. Bitcoin has followed Metcalfe's law. Metcalfe's law defines network growth and has also applied to things like the internet, Facebook, or other systems that rely on the network effect. The Bitcoin network's true value is its trustless peer-to-peer settlement network. Initially, Bitcoin had no dollar value. The early adopters were just running the mining software on their PCs, mining Bitcoin, and sending it back and forth just as a fun tech project. But in 2010, exchanges started to appear that allowed individuals to buy and sell Bitcoin. Of course, this assigned a dollar value to the Bitcoin. Initially, that dollar value was just pennies per Bitcoin. But now that has grown to be over $100,000 per coin. That's because around the world, people have grown to understand the value and the benefit of Bitcoin. First and foremost is scarcity. There will only ever be 21 million coins. That's as opposed to the discussions in previous chapters about the ongoing debasement of fiat currencies. It also has benefits to our electrical system and human rights, which will be covered in later chapters. Chapter 22 is cryptocurrencies and trade-offs. And in this chapter, Lyn walks through some other cryptocurrencies that were developed and why so far they've failed to compete with Bitcoin. She breaks down some of the alternatives and what the compromises are that each made. She lists 4 different categories where these failures have happened. First is transaction throughput. Some of these networks have tried to improve and speed up the system versus Bitcoin's roughly 10-minute block time. But this comes with some consequences. For example, the software and the size of the blockchain becomes much, much larger, which leads to more centralization. Next is privacy. Some networks have tried to be more private than Bitcoin is, but as a result, it leads to opacity, which was mentioned in a previous chapter. And with more opacity, it's more hard to validate the truth of the blockchain. Third is code complexity. Some of the networks have tried to adopt smart contracts and other advanced uses for the blockchain. However, this requires much, much more code, which opens the door to more bugs or attack surface. And finally, energy usage. Some of the networks tried to reduce Bitcoin's proof of work system with proof of stake. And this results in kind of a circular validation that requires trust and more centralization to sustain. Chapter 23 is the Lightning Network. In this chapter, Lyn details the Level 2 Lightning Network that's built on top of the Bitcoin blockchain. This Lightning Network provides fast micropayments, preserving base-level security. It's much faster, more scalable, and allows more privacy in transactions. It facilitates small payments, like buying a cup of coffee, or something what I do now is use Bitcoin using the Lightning Network to pay for my hamburgers at Steak 'n Shake. This allows the use of Bitcoin as a currency without relying on the on-chain settlement for each transaction. Chapter 24 explains the differences between proof of work versus proof of stake. It defends Bitcoin's proof of work energy-based security against proof of stake's centralization risk. Bitcoin's proof of work energy usage requires less outside governance because energy is the neutral arbiter of truth. Shifting to proof of stake means governance is needed, resulting in centralization. Chapter 25, How Bitcoin Uses Energy, expands on Bitcoin's energy use. Alden explains that even as large as Bitcoin has grown, it still uses less than 1% of the global electricity, and it often uses stranded electricity, like that from hydro dams, that otherwise would be wasted. Lyn explains how the block subsidy incentivizes miners to support the network, and that mining can be flexible and shut off during periods of high demand, helping to balance the electricity grid. Chapter 26 is Cryptocurrency Risk Analysis. In this chapter, Lyn takes a very balanced view at the risks that face Bitcoin. She covers volatility, regulation risk, but she highlights the resilience that the network has shown so far. She explains her history with Bitcoin and how originally she was skeptical when she was first introduced to Bitcoin in 2011 and again in 2013, but explains how she began to understand and be more comfortable with Bitcoin beginning in 2017. She presents some true cautions that all investors should be aware of about existing risks, like quantum computing, nation-state 51% attacks, and government regulations and bans. Chapter 27 is Stablecoins and Central Bank Digital Currencies. In this chapter, Lyn compares and contrasts two other types of cryptocurrencies. Both are tied to a fiat dollar value or fiat currency value, but the first is stablecoins, which is issued by a third party. For example, Tether is issued by a third-party company, but it is tied to $1. So it's stable versus the dollar. By contrast, central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs, are issued by the government and also are tied to the fiat currency value, but can be controlled by the government. This chapter does a good job of comparing and contrasting these two types of cryptocurrencies. Now we're at the final section of the book, or part 6, Financial Technology and Human Rights. This section really shows what the impact of new technologies like Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies can have on people around the world. Chapter 28 is the degradation of privacy. In this chapter, Lyn explains how, in recent decades, most of our transactions have shifted from physical, using cash, to digital transactions, and this has been a real challenge to our right to transactional privacy. In the past, physical transactions using cash meant surveillance was very difficult, and this preserved our privacy. Bearer instruments like cash were difficult to track and collect data on our spending. But surveillance technology has continued to expand as transactions have gone more and more digital. Lyn shares in this chapter how Bitcoin is a modern-day bearer instrument that can help us preserve our privacy. Chapter 29 is an asymmetric defense. In this chapter, Lyn argues that a decentralized money using encryption can help empower the oppressed and help us all maintain our privacy. She explains that encryption is itself an asymmetric defense. She references back to a Cypherpunk's Manifesto, which was an essay written by Eric Hughes in 1993. In this essay, Eric makes the distinction between privacy and secrecy. He defines privacy as the power to selectively reveal oneself to the world, deciding what we share, with whom, and when. Conversely, secrecy he defines as the act of hiding information entirely. This chapter makes the point that encryption is a powerful tool to help us preserve our privacy. Chapter 30 is the final chapter of the book. It's called A World of Openness or A World of Control. In this final chapter, she references back to the beginning of the book and the concept of money as a ledger, and she envisions two possible future worlds. The first is a world with open ledgers, which foster freedom, and the second is a world with controlled ledgers, which enable authoritarianism. Lyn shares a recent real-world example that highlights these two potential future outcomes. And this example was the 2022 Canadian trucker protest. In this example, the Canadian government really wanted to shut down the protests, and they took extraordinary actions to cut off funds from flowing to the protesters, even though there really wasn't legal justification allowing them to do this. They froze bank accounts, and they even worked with third-party fundraising sites to cut off the funds. In the end, Bitcoin became the only method to get funds to the protesters. Lyn highlights the fact that this is not about circumventing the law, but it's about putting the citizens on a more level playing field with the government and requiring the government to follow the law before taking actions like the Canadian government did in this case. I have three main takeaways from this book. The first is that technology has always driven changes to money, some for the good and some for the bad. The second is that we need to understand the current state of our financial system and take action to protect ourselves from the ongoing debasement of our fiat currencies. And third, we need to also understand and defend our right to transactional privacy. Broken Money has become my go-to recommendation for people that want a deep understanding of how money works. For people that want a more approachable and less deep review of similar topics, I can recommend The Big Print by Larry Lepard or The Hidden Cost of Money by Seb Bunny. Lyn Alden is one of the brightest minds in the area of finance today, and Broken Money stands out as a seminal work in this space.